The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as Jesus Martinez stepped out onto his front porch. The old wooden boards creaked under his weathered boots, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Jesus took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of ripe apples and freshly turned earth. At 65, Jesus had spent most of his life on this small farm just outside of Bakersfield, California. The land had been in his family for generations, passed down from father to son like a cherished heirloom. Now, it was just Jesus and the endless rows of crops that stretched out before him. As he made his way down the worn path that led to his fields, Jesus couldn't help but feel the weight of loneliness pressing down on his shoulders. It had been 5 years since his wife, Maria, had passed away, leaving him to tend to the farm and their memories alone. Their children had long since moved away, seeking opportunities in the bustling cities that seemed a world away from the quiet life Jesus knew. The routine of farm life had become both a comfort and a cage for Jesus. Each day blended into the next, a never-ending cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. He found solace in the simplicity of his tasks, but there was an emptiness that even the most bountiful harvest couldn't fill. As he reached the edge of his property, where his land met the wild, untamed brush that separated his farm from his neighbors, Jesus noticed something unusual. There, half hidden in the tall grass, was a shape that didn't belong. His curiosity piqued, he cautiously approached, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket knife he always carried. As he drew closer, the shape came into focus, and Jesus's breath caught in his throat. It was a horse, lying on its side, its coat matted with dirt and what looked alarmingly like dried blood. The animal's sides heaved with labored breaths, and its eyes, when they flickered open, were clouded with pain and fear. Jesus's heart ached at the sight. In all his years on the farm, he had never come across such a pitiful creature. Without a second thought, he knelt beside the horse, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over its trembling form. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The horse's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but it made no attempt to move. As Jesus carefully examined the animal, he could see the extent of its injuries. Deep gashes marred its flanks, and its ribs pressed against its skin, a clear sign of malnutrition. A wave of determination washed over Jesus. He couldn't leave this poor creature to suffer alone in the field. With gentle hands and soft words, he began to coax the horse to its feet. It was a slow, painful process. The horse stumbled and faltered, but Jesus remained patient, offering encouragement with every small victory. "That's it," he said, as the horse finally stood on shaky legs. "You're doing great. Just a little farther now." The journey back to the barn was arduous. Jesus led the horse step by agonizing step, pausing whenever the animal needed to rest. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they made their way across the fields, and Jesus could feel sweat trickling down his back. But he didn't mind the discomfort. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the daily grind of farm work. When they finally reached the barn, Jesus set about creating a makeshift stall. He spread fresh hay on the floor and filled a bucket with clean water. The horse watched him warily, but there was a glimmer of trust in its eyes that hadn't been there before. As Jesus began the task of cleaning the horse's wounds, he found himself talking to the animal, sharing stories of his life on the farm. He told the horse about Maria, about the children who rarely visited, about the lonely nights when the silence of the house seemed to press in on him from all sides. "Looks like we both could use a friend," he said, gently applying antiseptic to a particularly nasty cut. The horse nickered softly in response, as if agreeing with his assessment. Hours passed as Jesus tended to the horse. He cleaned its coat, picking out burrs and tangles, and made sure it had plenty of food and water. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barn floor, Jesus stepped back to survey his work. The horse looked better already. Its eyes were clearer, and it held its head a little higher. There was still a long road ahead, but Jesus felt a spark of hope that he hadn't experienced in years. "Well," he said, patting the horse's neck, "I guess you'll be staying with us for a while. We'll get you back on your feet in no time." As he made his way back to the house, Jesus felt a lightness in his step that had been absent for far too long. The loneliness that had been his constant companion seemed to have retreated, if only for the moment. He had a new purpose now, a reason to look forward to the dawn of a new day. That night, as Jesus lay in bed, his thoughts weren't filled with the usual worries about crop yields and market prices. Instead, he found himself thinking about the horse in the barn, wondering about its past and imagining its future. For the first time in years, he fell asleep with a smile on his face, eager for the morning to come. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jesus divided his time between his regular farm duties and caring for the horse. He researched horse care online, poring over articles about equine nutrition and wound treatment. He even called the local vet, Dr. Sarah Thompson, for advice. Jesus Martinez, Dr. Thompson had said, surprise evident in her voice. I haven't heard from you since. Well, it's been a while. What can I do for you? Jesus explained the situation, and Dr. Thompson promised to stop by the farm to check on the horse. Her visit confirmed what Jesus had already suspected. The horse was on the mend, but it would take time and patience to nurse it back to full health. As the days turned into weeks, Jesus found himself looking forward to his time in the barn. He'd named the horse Esperanza, Hope, and she was living up to her name. Each day brought small improvements. Her coat regained some of its luster, her wounds began to heal, and she started to put on weight. But it wasn't just Esperanza who was changing. Jesus, too, felt a transformation taking place. The routine of caring for another living being had given his life new meaning. He woke each morning with a sense of purpose, eager to check on Esperanza's progress. His neighbors, however, were less enthusiastic about the new addition to Jesus's farm. Word had spread quickly in the small community, and not everyone approved of Jesus's decision to take in the injured horse. You're wasting your time and money on that nag, Bob Johnson, his nearest neighbor, told him one day over the fence that separated their properties. It'll never be good for anything. You should have called animal control and let them deal with it. Jesus just shrugged off the criticism. He knew that Bob and others like him couldn't understand the bond that was forming between him and Esperanza. They couldn't see how the simple act of caring for her was healing something in Jesus that he hadn't even realized was broken. As autumn gave way to winter, Jesus found himself spending more and more time in the barn. He'd pull up a stool next to Esperanza's stall and talk to her as he groomed her coat or checked her healing wounds. He told her about his life, about the joys and sorrows he'd experienced over the years. You know, Esperanza, he said one chilly evening as he rubbed her down after a short walk around the barnyard, I think you might be the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Who would have thought an old man like me would find a friend like you? Esperanza nickered softly, nuzzling Jesus's hand. In that moment, he felt a connection that went beyond words, an understanding that transcended the barriers between man and animal. He knew, with a certainty that warmed him from the inside out, that he had made the right decision that fateful morning when he had found her in the field. As he made his way back to the house that night, Jesus looked up at the star-filled sky and felt a sense of peace settle over him. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long seemed to have retreated, pushed back by the warmth of the bond he shared with Esperanza. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Caring for a horse was no small task, especially for a man his age. But as he looked back at the barn, where Esperanza was settling in for the night, Jesus felt ready to face whatever came his way. He had found a new purpose, a reason to greet each day with hope and anticipation. For the first time in years, Jesus Martinez felt truly alive. As winter settled over the Bakersfield farmlands, news of Jesus Martinez's newfound companion spread through the community like wildfire. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, it didn't take long for Jesus's neighbors to catch wind of the injured horse he'd taken in. The local diner, Rose's Place, buzzed with gossip over steaming cups of coffee and plates of apple pie. Did you hear about Old Man Martinez? Edna Wilson, the town's self-appointed news broadcaster, leaned in conspiratorially to her breakfast companions. He's gone and turned his barn into some kind of horse hospital. Can you believe it? The reactions were mixed, but skepticism seemed to be the prevailing sentiment. Many of the locals, hardened by years of economic struggles and failed crops, couldn't understand why anyone would waste time and resources on a lost cause. Bob Johnson, Jesus's next-door neighbor, was particularly vocal about his disapproval. It's foolishness, pure and simple, he declared, slamming his coffee mug down for emphasis. That Martinez is gonna run himself into the ground trying to save some broken-down nag. Mark my words. As the days passed, curiosity got the better of some of the townsfolk. A steady stream of visitors began to trickle onto Jesus's property, ostensibly to check in on their neighbor but really to get a glimpse of the horse that had become the talk of the town. Jesus, never one for unnecessary socializing, found himself growing increasingly frustrated with the intrusions. He'd always been a private man, content with his solitude, but now he felt like he was living in a fishbowl. Every time he stepped out of his house or ventured into town for supplies, he was met with sidelong glances and not-so-subtle whispers. One crisp morning, as Jesus was mucking out Esperanza's stall, he heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Stepping out of the barn, he saw a group of his neighbors walking up the driveway, led by Bob Johnson. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and judgment. "Morning, Jesus," Bob called out, his tone falsely cheerful. "We thought we'd stop by and see how you're getting on with your project." Jesus straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken criticism hanging heavy in the air. But as he looked back at Esperanza, standing calmly in her stall, he felt a surge of determination. "She's doing just fine," he replied, his voice level but firm. "Thanks for your concern." Bob exchanged glances with the others before continuing. "Look, Jesus, we're just worried about you. This isn't some stray cat we're talking about. Horses are expensive to keep, and this one, well, it doesn't look like it'll ever be good for much." Jesus felt a flare of anger, but he tamped it down. These were his neighbors, people he'd known for years. They might not understand, but their intentions weren't malicious. Still, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment at their lack of faith. "I appreciate your concern," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But Esperanza is my responsibility now. I made a choice to help her, and I'm sticking to it." The group shuffled uncomfortably, clearly not expecting such a firm response from the usually quiet Jesus. After a moment of awkward silence, they began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. As they walked away, Jesus could hear snippets of their conversation. "Esperanza? He named it. Poor old fool. He's lost his marbles. Someone should do something." Jesus sighed heavily as he watched them go. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. In a small town like theirs, people had long memories and strong opinions. But as he turned back to the barn, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Let them talk, he thought. He knew in his heart he was doing the right thing. Inside the barn, Esperanza nickered softly as Jesus approached. He ran a hand along her neck, feeling the strength returning to her muscles. "Don't you worry about them," he murmured. "We'll show them all what you're made of." Over the next few weeks, the criticism continued to mount. Jesus found himself the subject of concerned talks from well-meaning friends and pointed remarks from less charitable neighbors. Even the local feed store owner, Mike Donnelly, tried to dissuade him. "Jesus, my friend," Mike said one day as Jesus was loading up on horse feed, "I've known you for years, and I've never seen you like this. Are you sure this is a good idea? Horses are a young man's game, and this one, well, it might be kinder to put it down." Jesus felt a flash of anger at the suggestion, but he pushed it aside. "Mike," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I appreciate your concern. But Esperanza is more than just a horse to me. She's given me something I thought I'd lost. I can't explain it, but I'm not giving up on her." Mike shook his head, but he didn't push the issue further. As Jesus drove home, his truck loaded with feed and supplies, he couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. It seemed like the whole town was against him, unable or unwilling to understand the bond he'd formed with Esperanza. But with each passing day, Jesus found himself caring less and less about what others thought. He threw himself into Esperanza's care with renewed vigor. He spent hours researching horse rehabilitation techniques, even reaching out to an equine therapy center in the next county for advice. Dr. Sarah Thompson, the local vet, became a frequent visitor to the farm. Unlike many of the townsfolk, she saw the positive changes in both Jesus and Esperanza. "You know, Jesus," she said during one of her checkups, "I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. The progress Esperanza's made, it's remarkable. And if you don't mind me saying, you seem different too. There's a spark in you that wasn't there before. Jesus felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. It was nice to have someone else see what he felt in his heart. She's something special, Doc, he replied, patting Esperanza's flank. I don't know where I'd be without her. As winter began to give way to spring, the changes in both Jesus and Esperanza became more pronounced. The horse's coat gleamed with health, and she moved with increasing confidence. Jesus, too, seemed to have shed years off his appearance. His step was lighter, his eyes brighter, and there was a new energy about him that was hard to miss. Even some of the harshest critics in town couldn't deny the transformation. Bob Johnson, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of Jesus's foolish endeavor, found himself watching over the fence one afternoon as Jesus led Esperanza around the paddock. The horse moved with grace and strength, a far cry from the broken creature she had been just a few months ago. Well, I'll be damned, Bob muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Jesus caught sight of his neighbor and raised a hand in greeting. To his surprise, Bob returned the gesture, a grudging respect in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Jesus turned back to Esperanza, he felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over him. They had come so far together, defying the odds and the naysayers. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Jesus felt truly excited about the future. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set over his fields, Jesus reflected on the journey of the past few months. The criticism had been hard to bear at times, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He and Esperanza had proved that with patience, dedication, and love, even the most broken spirits could be healed. As if sensing his thoughts, Esperanza nickered softly from her paddock. Jesus smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over him. Let them talk, he thought. He knew he had found something precious, something that no amount of criticism could tarnish. With a lighter heart, Jesus stood up and made his way to the barn for the evening check. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready to face them. He and Esperanza would face them together. As spring blossomed across the Bakersfield farmlands, Jesus Martinez found himself settling into a new routine. His days, once marked by solitary work in the fields, were now punctuated by the gentle rhythms of caring for Esperanza. The physical wounds that had marred her coat when he first found her were healing nicely, but Jesus knew that the real challenge lay in healing the invisible scars of fear and mistrust. Every morning, Jesus would wake before dawn, brew a strong pot of coffee, and head out to the barn. He'd stand at the entrance, mug in hand, and watch as Esperanza stirred in her stall. Those quiet moments, filled with the soft sounds of horses shuffling and birds awakening, became Jesus's favorite part of the day. Morning, beautiful, he'd say softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Esperanza would lift her head, her ears pricking forward at the sound of his voice. It was a small gesture, but it never failed to warm Jesus's heart. The process of building trust was slow and sometimes frustrating. Esperanza, while no longer overtly fearful, remained wary of sudden movements or loud noises. Jesus learned to move with deliberate slowness around her, to telegraph his actions before he made them. Easy now, he'd murmur as he approached with a brush or a bucket of feed. It's just me. Nothing to worry about. Dr. Sarah Thompson, who continued to check in on Esperanza's progress, was impressed by Jesus's patience. You've got a real gift with her, she remarked one sunny afternoon as they watched Esperanza graze in the paddock. Most people would have given up by now. Jesus shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ain't about giving up or not, he said. It's about doing right by her. She's been through enough already. As the days grew longer and warmer, Jesus began to introduce Esperanza to new experiences. He'd lead her on short walks around the property, letting her explore the sights and smells of the farm. At first, she was skittish, starting at every rustle in the bushes or call of a bird. But with Jesus's steady presence beside her, she gradually grew more confident. One particularly memorable day, Jesus decided to try something new. He'd been reading about equine therapy and the importance of touch in building trust. Armed with a soft brush and a pocketful of apple slices, he entered Esperanza's stall with a determined look on his face. "All right, girl," he said, holding out an apple slice. "Let's try something different today." Esperanza's nostrils flared as she caught the scent of the apple. She stretched her neck out, lips quivering as she delicately took the treat from Jesus's palm. As she chewed, Jesus slowly raised the brush, making sure she could see it clearly. "This here's just a brush," he explained, as if she could understand every word. "Gonna make you feel real good, I promise." With infinite patience, Jesus began to brush Esperanza's coat. He started at her neck, using long, gentle strokes. At first, Esperanza tensed, but as Jesus continued his steady rhythm, she began to relax. Her head lowered, her eyes half closed in contentment. Jesus felt a lump form in his throat. This simple act of grooming felt monumental, a breakthrough in their relationship. "That's my girl," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. From that day on, grooming became a daily ritual for Jesus and Esperanza. It was more than just maintaining her coat, it was a time of bonding, of wordless communication through touch. Jesus found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, when the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving just him and Esperanza. As Esperanza's trust in Jesus grew, so did her personality. The timid, broken creature he had found in the field was slowly giving way to a horse with spirit and sass. She'd nicker impatiently when Jesus was late with her breakfast, or playfully nudge him with her nose when she wanted attention. Jesus couldn't help but laugh at her antics. "You're getting to be a real handful, you know that," he'd say, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Esperanza would just toss her head, as if to say, "And what are you going to do about it?" The change in Jesus was just as noticeable. The lines of loneliness that had etched themselves on his face over the years seemed to soften. He walked with a new spring in his step, and there was a light in his eyes that had been missing for far too long. Even the townspeople, who had been so critical at first, couldn't help but notice the transformation. Edna Wilson, ever the gossip, found a new topic of conversation at Rose's place. "Have you seen Old Man Martinez lately?" she'd ask, leaning in conspiratorially. "I swear, that horse of his is working miracles. He looks 10 years younger." Bob Johnson, who had been one of Jesus's harshest critics, found himself eating his words. One evening, as he was driving past Jesus's farm, he saw the old man and Esperanza out for their evening walk. The sight of them moving in perfect sync, the trust between man and horse palpable even from a distance, made Bob pull over to watch. As Jesus and Esperanza approached, Bob called out, "Evening, Jesus. Horse is looking good." Jesus nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Evening, Bob. Her name's Esperanza." Bob cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Listen, Jesus, I may have been a bit hasty in my judgment. Seems like you knew what you were doing after all." Jesus just nodded, accepting the awkward apology for what it was. As he and Esperanza continued their walk, he felt a sense of vindication wash over him. They had proved the doubters wrong, together. As spring turned to summer, Jesus decided it was time to take the next step in Esperanza's rehabilitation. With Dr. Thompson's approval, he began to introduce the idea of riding. It was a slow process, starting with just getting Esperanza used to the weight of a saddle on her back. The first time Jesus placed the saddle on her, Esperanza snorted and sidestepped nervously. "Easy, girl," Jesus soothed, running a hand along her neck. "Nothing to be scared of. We'll take it nice and slow." Over the next few weeks, Jesus worked patiently with Esperanza, getting her accustomed to the saddle and bridle. He'd lead her around the paddock, letting her get used to the feeling of the tack. Slowly but surely, Esperanza began to accept the new equipment as part of her routine. The day Jesus finally swung himself into the saddle for the first time was a milestone for both of them. He could feel Esperanza tense beneath him, unsure of this new development. "It's just me, beautiful," he murmured, patting her neck. "We're in this together, remember?" Slowly, cautiously, Jesus urged Esperanza forward. She took a tentative step, then another. Before long, they were walking steadily around the paddock. Jesus felt a rush of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. This was more than just a ride, it was a testament to the trust they had built, to the bond that had formed between them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jesus guided Esperanza back to the barn. He dismounted, his legs a bit shaky from the excitement of the day, and pressed his forehead against Esperanza's neck. "We did it, girl," he whispered. "We really did it." That night, as Jesus sat on his porch watching the stars come out, he reflected on the journey of the past few months. He thought about the broken, frightened horse he had found in the field, and the strong, spirited mare she had become. He thought about his own transformation, how caring for Esperanza had filled a void in his life he hadn't even realized was there. In nurturing Esperanza, Jesus had rediscovered a part of himself he thought he had lost. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long had retreated, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. He had taken a chance on a wounded animal, and in return, he had received the greatest gift of all, hope. As if sensing his thoughts, Esperanza nickered softly from her paddock. Jesus smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new milestones to reach. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. Jesus stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and made his way to the barn for one last check before bed. As he entered, Esperanza lifted her head, her eyes soft and trusting. Jesus felt his heart swell with affection. "Good night, Esperanza," he said softly, reaching out to stroke her nose. "Sweet dreams, beautiful." As he walked back to the house, Jesus felt lighter than he had in years. He and Esperanza had come so far together, overcoming obstacles and proving the doubters wrong. But more than that, they had found in each other a companion, a friend. And in that friendship, they had both found healing. The journey wasn't over, Jesus knew. There would be more challenges to face, more trust to build. But as he climbed into bed that night, Jesus felt nothing but excitement for what the future might hold. Whatever came their way, he and Esperanza would face it together. The lazy days of summer gave way to the crisp evenings of early fall in Bakersfield. The change of seasons brought with it a sense of anticipation on Jesus Martinez's farm. Esperanza had made remarkable progress over the past months, transforming from a broken, frightened creature into a strong, spirited mare. Jesus, too, had undergone a transformation, his once lonely existence now filled with purpose and joy. As October rolled in, Jesus began to consider entering Esperanza in the upcoming Fall Festival's horse show. It wasn't about winning, he told himself, but about showing the community how far they had come together. He shared his plans with Dr. Sarah Thompson during one of her routine checkups. "That's a wonderful idea, Jesus," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "Esperanza's come so far. It would be great for everyone to see her progress." Jesus nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Might shut up some of the naysayers too," he added with a chuckle. Little did Jesus know that his plans had been overheard by an unexpected visitor. Manuel Ramirez, a struggling farmer from the next county over, had come to Bakersfield looking for work. He'd heard whispers about the miracle horse at the Martinez farm and had stopped by, curious to see for himself. As Manuel watched Jesus and Esperanza from afar, a plan began to form in his mind. Times were tough, and a horse like Esperanza could fetch a pretty penny. It wasn't right, he knew, but desperation has a way of clouding one's judgment. For the next week, Manuel observed the farm, learning Jesus's routine. He noticed that Jesus always did a final check on Esperanza around 9 p.m. before turning in for the night. After that, the farm was quiet until dawn. On a moonless night in mid-October, Manuel put his plan into action. He waited until the lights in Jesus's farmhouse went out, then crept towards the barn. The old structure's door creaked as he eased it open, causing Esperanza to stir in her stall. "Easy, girl," Manuel whispered, his heart pounding. He approached slowly, holding out an apple as a peace offering. Esperanza, used to kindness from humans thanks to Jesus's care, accepted the treat cautiously. With shaking hands, Manuel slipped a halter over Esperanza's head and led her out of the barn. Every sound seemed magnified in the still night air, the crunch of gravel under hoof, the soft nickering of the confused horse, the pounding of Manuel's own heart. As they reached the edge of the property, Manuel glanced back at the darkened farmhouse. For a moment, guilt threatened to overwhelm him. But the thought of his own struggling farm, of his family going hungry, steeled his resolve. With a quiet click of his tongue, he urged Esperanza forward into the night. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Jesus woke with the sun, as was his habit, and made his way to the barn, a spring in his step. But as he approached, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. The barn door was ajar, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. "Esperanza?" Jesus called out, his voice tight with sudden fear. He rushed into the barn, his eyes going immediately to her stall. It was empty. For a moment, Jesus stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Then reality crashed over him like a wave. Esperanza was gone. The next few hours passed in a blur. Jesus called the sheriff, reported Esperanza missing, and began a frantic search of his property. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't a case of a horse wandering off. Esperanza had been taken. As word spread through the town, the community's reaction was mixed. Some, like Dr. Thompson and Mike from the feed store, rallied around Jesus, organizing search parties and putting up flyers. Others, like Bob Johnson, couldn't help but mutter "I told you so" under their breath, seeing this as the inevitable outcome of Jesus's foolish endeavor. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Jesus spent every waking moment searching, driving up and down country roads, checking abandoned barns, following up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. But each day ended the same way, with Jesus returning to an empty barn, the weight of loss heavy on his shoulders. The absence of Esperanza was like a physical ache. Jesus found himself going through the motions of his daily routine, but the joy had gone out of his world. The barn, once a place of comfort and companionship, now felt oppressively empty. He'd stand in Esperanza's stall, running his hand over the worn wood where she used to rest her head, and feel his heart break all over again. One evening, about a month after Esperanza's disappearance, Jesus sat on his porch, staring out at the setting sun. He felt older than he had in years, the lines of worry and sadness etched deeply on his face. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the crunch of gravel as a car pulled up his driveway. To his surprise, it was Linda Garcia, a waitress from Rose's Place. Linda had always been kind to Jesus, offering a sympathetic ear and an extra slice of pie when he stopped in for coffee. Now, she hurried up the porch steps, her face flushed with excitement. "Jesus," she said, slightly out of breath, "I think I might know where Esperanza is." Jesus felt his heart leap into his throat. "What? How?" he managed to croak out. Linda explained that her cousin worked at a farm supply store in the next county over. He overheard a guy talking about a horse he'd recently acquired. The description matches Esperanza. And get this, the guy seemed nervous, like he was hiding something. For the first time in weeks, Jesus felt a glimmer of hope. He pressed Linda for more details, the name of the town, any description of the man. It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than he'd had in weeks. The next morning, Jesus was up before dawn. He threw some supplies in his old pickup truck and set off, determination etched on his weathered face. The drive to the neighboring county seemed to take forever, each mile stretching out endlessly before him. As he pulled into the small town Linda had mentioned, Jesus felt a mix of hope and trepidation. What if this was another dead end? What if he found Esperanza, but she was hurt, or no longer remembered him? He pushed the doubts aside. He had to try. It took most of the day, but Jesus finally got a lead. An old-timer at the local diner remembered seeing a horse matching Esperanza's description at a farm on the outskirts of town. With directions scribbled on a napkin, Jesus set off, his heart pounding. As he turned down a dusty lane, Jesus saw a familiar figure in a distant paddock. His breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he'd know that horse anywhere. It was Esperanza. Jesus pulled up to the farmhouse, his hands shaking as he cut the engine. A man came out onto the porch, his face wary. Jesus recognized him immediately as Manuel Ramirez, a farmer he'd met at the county fair a few years back. "Manuel," Jesus said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Manuel's face crumpled, the weight of his guilt finally breaking through. "Jesus, I'm so sorry. Times have been so hard, and when I saw how beautiful and healthy she was, I thought I could sell her, save my farm. But I couldn't do it." Every time I looked at her, I saw the love and care you'd given her. I've been trying to work up the courage to bring her back." Jesus felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the theft, relief at finding Esperanza, and a surprising twinge of sympathy for Manuel's desperation. But mostly, he felt an overwhelming need to see his horse. "Take me to her," he said simply. As they approached the paddock, Esperanza lifted her head. For a moment, she stood still, staring at Jesus. Then, with a joyful whinny, she trotted over to the fence. Jesus felt tears spring to his eyes as he reached out to stroke her nose. "Hey, beautiful," he murmured. "I've missed you." The ride home was quiet, Esperanza safely loaded in a borrowed trailer, Manuel following behind in his own truck to return the trailer and face the consequences of his actions. Jesus's mind was a whirl of emotions, but above all, he felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. As they pulled up to his farm, Jesus saw a group of people waiting. Dr. Thompson, Linda, Mike from the feed store, even Bob Johnson. They were all there, faces anxious but hopeful. When they saw Esperanza, a cheer went up. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal on the Martinez farm. Manuel faced the legal consequences of his actions, but with Jesus's testimony about the remorse he'd shown, he was given a chance to make amends rather than serve jail time. As for Jesus and Esperanza, their bond was stronger than ever. The ordeal had proven what Jesus had known all along, that the connection between them was something special, something worth fighting for. One crisp autumn evening, as Jesus and Esperanza took their usual walk around the property, he found himself reflecting on the events of the past months. The fear and despair of Esperanza's absence, the joy of their reunion, the unexpected compassion he'd found for Manuel, it all swirled together in his mind. But as Esperanza nudged his shoulder affectionately, Jesus realized something. Every challenge, every setback, had only served to strengthen their bond. They had faced loss and separation, and come out the other side stronger for it. With a smile, Jesus patted Esperanza's neck. "What do you say, girl? Think we're ready for that fall festival after all?" Esperanza nickered softly, as if in agreement. And as the sun set over the Bakersfield hills, Jesus felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever the future held, he and Esperanza would face it together. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of hay and apples as Jesus Martinez led Esperanza back to her stall. It had been 2 weeks since her return, and the initial flurry of excitement had settled into a comfortable routine. Yet, for Jesus, each moment with Esperanza still felt like a gift. As he removed her halter, Jesus couldn't help but marvel at how quickly they had fallen back into sync. Despite the weeks apart, their bond seemed stronger than ever. Esperanza nuzzled his shoulder, her soft breath warm against his weathered skin. "That's my girl," Jesus murmured, running a hand along her neck. "We've been through quite a ride, haven't we?" The reunification had been more than just a happy ending to a harrowing ordeal. It had sparked a change in the Bakersfield community. People who had once been skeptical of Jesus's endeavor now stopped by regularly to check on Esperanza's progress. Even Bob Johnson, once his harshest critic, had taken to bringing carrots for the horse when he came to chat over the fence. One sunny Saturday morning, as Jesus was mucking out Esperanza's stall, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Stepping out of the barn, he saw Dr. Sarah Thompson's pickup truck pulling into his driveway. "Morning, Jesus," Sarah called out as she climbed down from the cab. "Thought I'd stop by and see how our girl is doing." Jesus smiled, wiping his hands on his jeans. "She's doing just fine, document. Come on in and see for yourself." As they walked into the barn, Esperanza nickered softly in greeting. Sarah's face lit up as she approached the stall. "Well, hello there, beautiful," she said, reaching out to stroke Esperanza's nose. "You're looking better than ever." Jesus watched with pride as Sarah examined Esperanza, checking her legs, teeth, and overall condition. The vet's smile grew wider with each passing moment. "Jesus," she said finally, turning to face him, "I've got to hand it to you. Esperanza's recovery is nothing short of miraculous. Not just physically, but emotionally too. The trust she has in you, it's remarkable." Jesus felt a lump form in his throat. "She's something special, all right," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then said, You know, there's a charity event coming up next month at the Golden Oak Stables. They're looking for success stories to showcase the power of equine therapy. Have you thought about participating? Jesus blinked in surprise. The idea of showcasing Esperanza had crossed his mind, but he'd always dismissed it as a passing fancy. Now, with Sarah suggesting it, the possibility suddenly seemed real. I don't know, Doc, he said slowly. Esperanza's come a long way, but a big event like that, it might be too much for her. Sarah shook her head, her eyes twinkling. I think you're underestimating both of you. Just think about it, okay? It could be a great opportunity to show everyone how far you've come together. After Sarah left, Jesus found himself mulling over her suggestion. He watched Esperanza grazing peacefully in the paddock, her coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight. She had come so far from the broken, frightened creature he'd found in the field. Maybe it was time to share their story with others. That evening, as Jesus sat on his porch watching the sunset, he made his decision. He'd enter Esperanza in the charity event. It would be a challenge, but they'd faced bigger obstacles before. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Jesus worked with Esperanza every day, getting her used to different environments and sounds. He enlisted the help of Linda from Rose's Place, who had experience with show horses, to give him pointers on presentation. The whole town seemed to rally behind them. Mike from the feed store donated a shiny new saddle for the event. Edna Wilson, the town gossip, surprised everyone by offering to groom Esperanza for the big day. Even Manuel Ramirez, still working to make amends for the theft, pitched in by helping Jesus repair and paint his old horse trailer. As the day of the event drew near, Jesus felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He'd never been one for the spotlight, preferring the quiet solitude of his farm. But as he watched Esperanza prancing around the paddock, her head held high, he knew they were ready. The morning of the event dawned clear and cool. Jesus was up before the sun, giving Esperanza one last brush and pep talk before loading her into the trailer. As he climbed into his truck, he saw a group of townspeople gathered at the end of his driveway. They waved and cheered as he drove past, a show of support that brought a lump to his throat. The Golden Oak Stables was bustling with activity when they arrived. Horses of all breeds and colors were being led around, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. For a moment, Jesus felt out of place among the polished riders and their well-bred mounts. But then he felt Esperanza's calm presence beside him, and his doubts melted away. As they waited for their turn to present, Jesus overheard snippets of conversation from the crowd. People were talking about the miracle horse and her devoted owner. He realized with a start that their story had spread beyond Bakersfield, touching hearts across the county. Finally, it was their turn. Jesus led Esperanza into the arena, his heart pounding. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, recounting their journey from that fateful day in the field to their triumphant reunion. As they circled the arena, Jesus felt Esperanza's steady rhythm beneath him, her confidence boosting his own. When they finished their presentation, the applause was thunderous. Jesus saw tears in the eyes of many spectators, moved by their story of perseverance and love. As they exited the arena, they were swarmed by people wanting to meet Esperanza and hear more about their journey. Among the crowd, Jesus spotted a familiar face. It was Manuel Ramirez, standing off to the side, a look of wonder and regret on his face. Jesus caught his eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd all come. As the day wound down, Jesus and Esperanza were awarded a special recognition for most inspiring journey. But the real prize, Jesus knew, was the journey itself. As he loaded Esperanza into the trailer for the trip home, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. That night, after they'd returned home and Esperanza was settled in her stall, Jesus sat on his porch, reflecting on the day's events. The porch light cast a warm glow, and in the distance, he could hear the soft nickering of Esperanza in her barn. He thought about the long road they'd traveled together. The day he'd found her, broken and afraid in that field, seemed like a lifetime ago. They'd faced doubt, separation, and hardship, but had emerged stronger for it. Esperanza had not only healed physically, but had also helped heal the loneliness in Jesus's heart. As if sensing his thoughts, Esperanza let out a soft whinny from the barn. Jesus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and made his way to the barn for one last check before bed. Esperanza lifted her head as he entered, her eyes soft and trusting in the dim light. Jesus reached out, running his hand along her neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath her gleaming coat. "We did it, girl," he murmured. "We showed them all." As he turned to leave, Jesus paused at the barn door, looking back at Esperanza. She gazed at him steadily, and in that moment, he felt a connection that went beyond words. They had saved each other, he realized. In giving Esperanza a second chance at life, Jesus had found his own renewal. Walking back to the house under a sky full of stars, Jesus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that he and Esperanza would face them together, their bond unbreakable. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Jesus's last thoughts were of Esperanza. In her, he had found not just a companion, but a kindred spirit. Their reunion had been more than just a happy ending, it was a new beginning, a promise of adventures yet to come. And in the barn, under the same starry sky, Esperanza slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that she was home, loved, and cherished. The broken, frightened horse from the field was gone, replaced by a strong, confident mare who had found her place in the world. Together, she and Jesus had written a story of hope, perseverance, and the transformative power of love. As winter melted into spring, the Bakersfield community buzzed with excitement. The annual Spring Fling Festival was approaching, and this year, it would feature something new, a charity horse race. The proceeds would go towards establishing an equine therapy program at the local children's hospital. Jesus Martinez heard about the race from Linda during one of his regular visits to Rose's place. As she refilled his coffee cup, Linda's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "You should enter Esperanza, Jesus," she suggested. "After your performance at the Golden Oak Stables, you too would be the talk of the town." Jesus chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know, Linda. Esperanza's come a long way, but a race? That's a whole different ballgame." But the seed had been planted. As Jesus drove home, his mind wandered to the possibility. Esperanza had shown such spirit and determination in her recovery. Maybe this was a chance to showcase just how far she'd come. That evening, as Jesus led Esperanza out for their usual walk, he found himself studying her with a critical eye. Her gait was strong and sure, her muscles well-defined under her gleaming coat. She pranced a bit, sensing his scrutiny, as if to say, "What are you thinking, old man? What do you say, girl?" Jesus murmured, patting her neck. "Think you've got a race in you?" Esperanza nickered softly, bumping her head against his shoulder. Jesus laughed, taking it as a sign of agreement. "All right then," he said. "Let's give it a shot." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Jesus worked with Esperanza every day, gradually increasing their training regimen. They started with long walks, building up to slow trots, and finally to controlled canters around the paddock. Dr. Sarah Thompson stopped by regularly to check on Esperanza's progress and offer advice on conditioning. "Remember, Jesus," she cautioned, "it's not about winning. It's about showing how far you've both come." The whole town seemed to rally behind them. Bob Johnson surprised everyone by offering his larger pasture for training. Mike from the feed store researched specialized racing diets and provided Jesus with top-quality feed. Even Manuel Ramirez, still working to make amends, volunteered to help exercise Esperanza on days when Jesus's arthritis was acting up. As the day of the race approached, Jesus felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He'd never been one for the spotlight, but he couldn't deny the thrill of preparing for the race. More than that, he was proud of Esperanza. The frightened, injured horse he'd found in the field was now a strong, confident mare, ready to take on a new challenge. The morning of the race dawned bright and clear. Jesus was up before the sun, giving Esperanza a thorough grooming. As he brushed her coat to a shine, he talked to her softly, more for his own comfort than hers. "We've come a long way, you and I," he murmured. "Whatever happens today, I'm proud of you, girl." When they arrived at the fairgrounds, Jesus was overwhelmed by the festive atmosphere. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the occasional whinny of an excited horse. As Jesus led Esperanza to the stables, they were greeted by cheers and well wishes from what seemed like half the town. Edna Wilson bustled over, a garland of flowers in her hands. "For good luck," she said, draping it over Esperanza's neck. The other competitors were a mixed bunch. There were sleek thoroughbreds from professional stables, sturdy quarter horses from local ranches, and even a few other rescue horses like Esperanza. Jesus felt a sense of camaraderie with the other riders, all of them here not just to race, but to support a good cause. As the time for the race drew near, Jesus led Esperanza to the starting line. His heart was pounding, and he could feel Esperanza's excitement in the way she pranced and tossed her head. He took a deep breath, centering himself. "All right, girl," he said softly, patting her neck. "Let's show them what we're made of." The starters pistol fired, and they were off. Esperanza leapt forward, her powerful legs eating up the ground. Jesus leaned low over her neck, feeling the rush of wind against his face. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, moving as one. They weren't the fastest out of the gate. Some of the younger, more experienced horses pulled ahead early. But Jesus didn't push Esperanza. He knew her strengths, knew that her endurance was her greatest asset. They settled into a steady rhythm, gradually gaining ground. As they rounded the first turn, Jesus could hear the roar of the crowd. He caught glimpses of familiar faces, Linda cheering wildly, Dr. Thompson watching intently, Bob Johnson waving his hat in the air. Their support buoyed him, giving him an extra boost of confidence. Halfway through the race, Esperanza began to pull ahead. One by one, they passed the horses that had taken an early lead. Jesus could feel Esperanza's strength, her determination. She wasn't just running a race, she was proving to everyone, and to herself, that she was more than her past. As they entered the final stretch, Jesus and Esperanza were neck and neck with a sleek bay thoroughbred. The other horse's rider was younger, more experienced, but Jesus and Esperanza had something he didn't, a bond forged through adversity and mutual trust. "Come on, girl," Jesus whispered. "Let's bring it home." With a burst of speed that took Jesus's breath away, Esperanza surged forward. They crossed the finish line a full length ahead of the thoroughbred, the crowd's cheers reaching a deafening crescendo. As they slowed to a stop, Jesus slid off Esperanza's back on shaky legs. He wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her mane. "We did it, girl," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "We really did it." The next few minutes were a blur of congratulations and photographs. Jesus accepted the winner's ribbon in a daze, still scarcely able to believe what had just happened. But more meaningful than any prize was the look of pride in Esperanza's eyes as she nuzzled his shoulder. As the excitement began to die down, Jesus led Esperanza back to the stables. He was surprised to find Manuel Ramirez waiting for them, a look of wonder on his face. "Jesus," Manuel said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. Seeing you two out there, it made me understand what I almost destroyed. Can you ever forgive me?" Jesus looked at Manuel for a long moment, then at Esperanza. The horse nickered softly, bumping her head against Manuel's shoulder. Jesus couldn't help but smile. "I think," he said slowly, "that Esperanza already has. And if she can, so can I." The two men shook hands, a gesture that symbolized not just forgiveness, but the healing power of second chances. Later that evening, as the sun set over Bakersfield, Jesus sat on his porch, the winner's ribbon hanging from a nail beside him. Esperanza grazed contentedly in the paddock, occasionally lifting her head to gaze at him. Jesus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From that fateful day in the field to the winner's circle at the spring fling, they had faced countless challenges. But through it all, their bond had only grown stronger. As the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Jesus felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He and Esperanza had proven that with love, patience, and trust, anything was possible. They had not just overcome the odds, they had rewritten their own story. Jesus stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and made his way to the barn for the nightly check. As he entered, Esperanza lifted her head, her eyes soft and trusting in the dim light. "Well, girl," Jesus said, reaching out to stroke her nose, What do you say we do this all again next year? Esperanza nickered softly, as if in agreement. And as Jesus turned to leave, he knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, he and Esperanza would face them together. They had found in each other not just a companion, but a partner, a friend, and a source of endless hope. The broken horse and the lonely farmer had healed each other, creating a bond that would last a lifetime. And in doing so, they had reminded an entire community of the transformative power of love, compassion, and second chances. As Jesus closed the barn door behind him, he looked up at the star-filled sky and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to grow. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. He and Esperanza were home, they were together, and they were ready for whatever life might bring next.